In 1988, Bill Krantz sat in his home in Boulder Canyon, Colorado, close to Roosevelt National Forest. It was about 10 a.m. and his wife and daughter were out shopping, so he was home alone when there was a series of thuds on the front door. Like knocking, but a little strange. Bill got up and headed towards the door. It was a bit odd to have someone knocking, not just because there weren't too many people around, but also he had a doorbell. Weirdly, this person chose not to use it, except it wasn't a person at his door. Impressive animals, mountain lions, found from Canada in the north all the way down to southern parts of Chile and Argentina. They have a wide range and also have a wide range of names, such as cougar, lion, mountain lion, puma, catamount, panther, Florida panther, and some less common ones like red tiger and red lions. There's also ghost cats, or one of my favorites, shadow cats. They have multiple names in multiple languages. Some have suggested there are as many as 40 names. In the Cougar Conundrum by Mark Elbroch, he writes that they have over 80 names. According to a lecture by Leslie Pattern, the reason they have so many names is because they are the most successful mammal in the Americas. I'll try to use the name based on the source when referring to them, but as often mentioned, they're very typically just referred to as lions, even though they don't belong to the Panthera family like true lions. It was once thought that with its wide range, Puma could be categorized into 32 subspecies, but despite this wide range and a variety of names, the 2017 study, A Revised Taxonomy of the Felidae, suggested that based on mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA, there are only 2 subspecies: Puma concolor, mostly South America, and Puma concolor cougar, mostly in North and Central America. Perhaps that will change in the future. The concolor part of the name refers to, well, the color, suggesting the puma is one color, which isn't exactly right. They generally do have a mostly kind of tawny brown coat. There have been some very rare cases of white cougars, although there are no confirmed cases of black cougars, at least not yet. In the Cougar Conundrum, Mark Elbroch writes that they are never black, and that if they were, we would have found one, or some proof of one, in the last 300 years, especially since cougars used to be hunted a lot. But in this video, we're looking more into mountain lion attacks on people. We'll cover a few cases from history, but our main focus is a brutal attack in Colorado, one that came with clear warning signs that were ignored by many until it was too late. But like I alluded to, humans and mountain lions have had a turbulent history, and they were nearly wiped out in North America. In terms of written records in North America, it seems some of the earliest bounties that were put out for cougars started hundreds of years ago when Jesuit priests offered bounties to Native Americans. Apparently you got 1 bull for every cougar killed. As time went on, more bounties spread through North America. Massachusetts in 1742, Pennsylvania in 1807, Oregon in 1843, and so it continued as the cougar was classified as a bountied predator, or in Utah, an obnoxious animal. As the 1800s continued forward, the mountain lion became less and less common, particularly east of the Rockies. And things didn't exactly improve in the early 1900s either, as the cat was seen as a menace to agriculture, particularly livestock. More and more regions started offering bounties for mountain lions. Not only bounties though. In some areas, the federal government hired hunters to kill the lions. The price paid for a dead lion increased in multiple areas as people tried to wipe them out or make them extinct in certain localities. Was this nationwide push to eradicate the cats all for the protection of livestock? Well, that's certainly a large part of it, but there were other reasons too. There was the idea that a mountain lion was a threat to humans. Some of the lion hunters were considered heroes, not just for protecting the livestock, but also for protecting people. Though the threat to people from these animals doesn't seem very high. From the first recorded human fatality in 1868 up until 1970, there are only 11 fatal attacks recorded, and one of those is likely a hoax. So about 10 deaths in 102 years isn't that many really. Perhaps there were a few more unrecorded deaths, of course, but even still, it doesn't seem like the threat to humans was particularly high, especially to adults. If we look at the first recorded fatality all the way up till 1990, there were about 16 fatalities on humans in North America, and there hadn't been any fatalities in Colorado yet. 11 of the fatalities were people under or at the age of 10, with most of the others only a few years older. There are 2 people where we don't know the age, but considering the description, I suspect they were adults. However, the only attack with an adult with a confirmed age was killed by a mountain lion in July of 1909. As written in the Morgan Hills Times, Isola Kenedy was a 38-year-old Sunday school teacher in Morgan Hill, California. In July of 1909, she took 5 boys from the Sunday school on a picnic to a place called Coyote Creek. After lunch, the boys decided to go swimming in a stream nearby. She heard the attack before she saw it. Screams from the children alerted Isola, and she saw a female mountain lion on top of 8-year-old Earl Wilson. Claws and teeth sunk into the boy, and he was submerged in the creek with the lion on top of him. Instantly, she picked up a stick and charged the animal, yelling at the boys to run and get help. On seeing the woman's approach, the mountain lion leaped onto her. The boys ran until they found a surveyor named Jack Conlon, and as soon as they told him what happened, he grabbed his shotgun and went to the scene. In the struggle, Isola had lost her stick and was now using a hat pin to fight against the large cat. Jack fired his shotgun, but it seemed to have no effect. According to the paper, the Morgan Hills Times, after the first shot was fired, Isola started yelling, "Don't shoot me, don't shoot me." In the twisting and turning of the fight, perhaps she was afraid that she could get shot. Jack made the decision to get his rifle instead and ran as fast as he could, but as fast as he could still took 15 minutes. That's a long time to be mauled by an animal, but when Jack returned, she was still, quote, conscious and struggling. He yelled at her to lay still, which somehow she did, and he fired a shot into the left shoulder, but it didn't stop the lion. The cat moved its head up, and when it did, Jack rammed the rifle into the cat's mouth and fired again. The mountain lion was dead, and Jack and his friend, Charles Fletcher, had to pry the animal's claws out of Isola. She and 8-year-old Earl were brought to the hospital. She was missing one ear and another was badly damaged. She also had a multitude of injuries on her face, arms, and legs. But her injuries, and Earl's, didn't seem to be fatal, except the mountain lion that attacked wasn't an ordinary lion. It had rabies, and Earl and Mrs. Kenedy had a few more weeks of suffering before they died. On her tombstone in Mount Hope Cemetery in Morgan Hill, it reads, "Sacrificed her life, battling a lion to save some small boys." It certainly wasn't the norm. As very few attacks, especially fatal ones, occurred, some people still feared mountain lions, sometimes due to a lack of understanding or sensationalized news reports. Apparently, made-up stories of attacks often made it to the papers. However, others also had some strong motivations for wanting them gone, not because they feared them per se, but more that they didn't like that lions killed the more desirable species, such as deer. Even some notable zoologists and conservationists, such as William Temple Hornaday, who fought for the protection of different birds and buffalo and other things, seemed to have less sympathy for predators like wolves and lions, finding it disgusting that they killed deer and elk. To some, it wasn't fair that a game animal like deer were being killed and consumed by something that wasn't human. Some areas were designated as game reserves, where they'd remove all the predators so that there would be more deer for humans to hunt without competition. A large preserve was established in 1906 near the Grand Canyon, where predators were eradicated so more game species could be hunted. It became a popular spot for some celebrity hunters, such as Zane Grey. When he wasn't writing westerns and misidentifying whale sharks, he was hunting at the park. The hope was that if the predators were eliminated, then the deer population would increase, and it went according to plan. But then, one day, people looked around and thought, wait, That's too many deer. The initial population of about 4,000 in the park exploded to nearly 100,000. The deer stripped the forests and countryside of any vegetation they could, transforming very large areas into barren wastelands. And then, there wasn't enough food for the deer, and the landscape was littered with dead deer and empty vegetation. Maybe having some predators around wasn't a completely terrible idea. In the 1960s, it seemed that some major shifts occurred in the perception of these animals. In a roundabout way, you could almost argue that pesticides led to more cougar protection. During the Second World War, insecticides and pesticides became widely used, including DDT, which was later used in agriculture to deal with things like mosquitoes and other pests. But it was also sprayed in other areas too, in the home, around the garden, sometimes straight onto people, sometimes straight into people's face. It was sprayed around neighborhoods and people's homes and gardens. In some cases, people may not have even wanted DDT on their garden. Well, too bad. Planes would often dump large amounts of it without getting permission from the owners of the land. Now, DDT was effective in ways at controlling malaria, but its widespread use posed some serious environmental risks. In one case, a bird sanctuary was doused with DDT without the owner's permission, prompting the owner, Olga Owens Huckins, to write to the Boston Herald about the incident before reaching out to a marine biologist named Rachel Carson, inspiring her to write a book called Silent Spring, which was like a massive expose on pesticides and their potential risks in using them. Both the Cougar Conundrum and Beast in the Garden mentioned the book Silent Spring as a catalyst that seemed to shift the public's view on nature and their place in it. It was certainly very influential, and in the 60s, the public view on mountain lions does seem to shift. Now, Florida was a little ahead of the curve. Perhaps the first ever cougar seen by a European was in Florida, with Spanish explorers in the early 1500s, but a few centuries later the populations had plummeted. However, in 1950, Florida classified panthers as game animals, and by 1958, legislation was passed to protect them. Across the country, the attitudes towards these large cats were shifting. Washington rescinded its cougar bounty program in 1962, followed by Montana and California in 1963, and Colorado in 1965. Over time, more states ended bounty programs, and the lion was gradually reclassified as a game animal. Now you might be thinking, so wait, they were still being hunted? They were, but now, instead of the state allowing and encouraging the killing of as many lions as possible without regulation, new rules were brought in so that only a certain number could be hunted at certain times and a license had to be acquired. This seemed to have the desired effect as the mountain lion populations bounced back, and with some exception, they mostly have full protection in California and Florida. As mountain lions started getting more protection in the 70s and 80s, their numbers began to increase. Normally these cats are pretty shy and stay out of the way of humans, but during this time, there were a few rare attacks that caught everyone off guard. It was strange because, by nature, mountain lions don't usually go after humans, making these incidents all the more unsettling. According to a 1984 UPI article, there was an attack in Big Bend National Park in Texas, where an 8-year-old boy named David Vaught was severely mauled by a mountain lion while hiking with his family. David sustained serious puncture wounds to his head and was taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. His stepfather attempted to fight off the lion and got injured in the process. The lion was captured and killed the following day, and authorities confirmed it was the one responsible for the attack. This marked the first ever recorded lion attack in the park's 40-year history. The lion was destroyed for rabies testing, but the results were not available at the time. The family had been hiking a short trail when David, who was about 20 feet ahead, was attacked by the lion. Park officials expressed confusion over the rare attack, which was unlike any previous incidents in the park's history. Other attacks happened not long after in other parts of the country. According to an article in the LA Times, on March 23, 1986, a 5-year-old Laura Small was attacked by a mountain lion at Ronald W. Casper's Wilderness Park in Orange County in California while wading in a stream, apparently looking for tadpoles. The lion suddenly sprang from a bush, grabbed her by the head, and dragged her into the underbrush. Her mother screamed and a passerby intervened, using a stick to force the lion to release Laura. The attack left Laura with partial paralysis, blindness in one eye, and severe scarring. Despite undergoing 15 surgeries, she struggled with daily tasks and faced bullying at school. It's pretty brutal to read her testimony of how she wasn't able to make friends in her elementary school, as, to quote her, "Everyone makes fun of me and calls me Cat Girl," and things like that. The attack led to a lawsuit against Orange County, with Laura's attorneys arguing that officials knew about mountain lion sightings in the park but failed to warn the public. Apparently, park rangers had raised concerns about unusual daytime sightings and were advised by the state officials to issue warnings. Now, the defense was kind of that mountain lions were shy, secretive animals without a strong history of attacking humans. The same year that Laura was attacked, just a few months after, a 6-year-old boy was also attacked at the same Ronald W. Casper's Wilderness Regional Park in Orange County. His parents said there were no warning signs of mountain lions. The behavior is odd not only from the standpoint of a lion coming into contact and attacking a human, but also even being seen by a human. It was, and still is, very rare for someone to see one of these cats. Jim Williams remarks many times in Path of the Puma about how the ghost cats of the Rockies earned their name, and how being able to slip by unseen, almost invisible, is what led to their success in a human-dominated world. It's interesting just how stealthy these animals can be. I once went to a theme park that turned out to be part zoo, with a handful of animals, one of which was a puma. The enclosure for the puma wasn't particularly huge, or particularly small to be fair, about what you'd expect, with a bit of foliage for the big cat to hide. And hide it did, incredibly well. So well that even after spending a good deal of time looking, I couldn't see it, and neither could anybody else. People came and went, staring into the enclosure before giving up, murmuring that the cat wasn't even there, moved to somewhere else. I scanned what I thought was every possible spot, but nothing seemed large enough to fully conceal an adult mountain lion. Then, just as we were about to walk away, a flicker of movement caught our eye. A twitch of a tail, and there it was, right in front of us, crouching in the grass, watching. In an enclosure designed for humans to view it, the puma had disappeared so completely that dozens of people failed to notice it. If it could vanish so effortlessly in captivity, just imagine how invisible it must be in the wild. Or if you can't imagine, we can look at the quote from Jim Williams: "Wander through lion country, and they'll see you, but you won't see them." Sometimes when people describe these animals, they sound like cryptids. In the Cougar Conundrum, Mark Elbroch even likens them to Bigfoot or the Chupacabra. There is a National Geographic short documentary called "See Why the Mysterious Mountain Lion is the Bigfoot of Big Cats," where researcher Bert W. Jerry says they are like Yetis. So, as you can imagine, it would be a little strange to have one knocking on your door. Let's return to 1988, to Bill Krantz in Boulder Canyon near Boulder Creek, next to Roosevelt National Forest. Home alone, with what sounded like knocking on his door. Well, he did what many of us would do. He walked around to the windows to look out onto the porch and onto his front yard. Now you might think that he saw a mountain lion, but no. He saw 4. He had lived there for 20 years and never seen a mountain lion before. It was a little unusual to see a lion, and they don't generally move together. Sometimes females will tolerate another female in their range, though this is more rare for males. And of course, the mother will travel with and look after her cubs up to a certain point, even when those cubs are quite large. It seemed perhaps that this group were mother and cubs. The cats were playing, or it looked like they were playing, and somehow in the process had hit the door. Unfortunately, one of the lions, Bill suspected the mother, had a trap wrapped around one of her legs. He reported it to the Department of Wildlife and to the Boulder Park Service, as they'd become very interested in mountain lions in the last few years. Boulder stood in a stark contrast to the nature domination of the previous century and was more of a pro-greenery, pro-wildlife, pro-nature area. Boulder stands out along the Front Range, a region towards central Colorado and southern Wyoming. It is known for preserving the diverse ecosystem that shape its foothills. According to the Boulder.gov wildlife website, open space and mountain parks are especially rich in wildlife, thanks to a mild climate and plenty of food and shelter. In many ways, Boulder was ahead of the curve in terms of environmental protection. According to AboutBoulder.com, back in 1967, Boulder residents voted to create the first locally funded green belt in the US. An increase in sales tax helped raise money for land purchase. By 1998, Boulder had secured 33,000 acres of mountain parks and open land. In Barron's book, he really paints the picture of Boulder of being a very sort of progressive, live and let live, be one with nature place. Specifically during the late 80s, there's even a quote, "If they don't appreciate nature, why are they living in Boulder?" While areas were being put aside for nature, other areas were being built and new homes created as people wanted to get closer and closer to the great outdoors. And humans and Mother Nature were on a collision course, in some cases quite literally. The booming deer population would sometimes get hit by cars. In 1986, to try and reduce the amount of vehicle collisions, road reflectors were installed, and they did have an impact. Collisions increased by 57%. Not only was there a large deer population, but the deer were encouraged to come closer to people. Again, according to Barron's book, Beast in the Garden, there were suggestions that people were planting particular plants and even putting out salt licks to entice deer to come closer into their yards and neighborhoods. Again, many came for the wildlife. Many people liked seeing deer in their parks and gardens. People really like deer. You know what else really likes deer? According to the USDA Forest Service, the mountain lion diet consists primarily of deer, both white-tailed deer and/or mule deer. It's true mountain lions consume a wide variety of mammals, but most sources seem to suggest that deer make up the lion's share of the diet. Difficult to find a nationwide study on the diet of mountain lions, but if we look at specific regions, deer seem to make up a large part of the diet of these animals. An article in the Journal of Mammalogy, Mountain Lion, Puma concolor, feeding behavior in the Little Missouri Badlands in North Dakota found that deer, quote, were the most prevalent item in mountain lions' diet, 76.9%. An older study in the 90s looking at the diet selection of mountain lions in southeastern Arizona looked at 370 scat samples and found that the most common occurrence was deer at 48%. I'm sure there is variation based on where the cats live, especially considering the wide range, and there's even some individual variation. As Jim Williams states in Path of the Puma, Chapter 7, when talking about lions being tracked in Alberta in the foothills next to the Rocky Mountains, quote, they found that while the overall mountain lion population subsisted mostly on deer, individual diets were diverse. Mountain lions will eat many things, but especially deer. Bill wasn't the only one to see mountain lions in his garden. Around the same time, a woman named Ponce Gebhardt had a similar sighting. She was at home, looking out at deer grazing in her yard in Knollwood in the middle of the day. While deer are usually most active from dawn to dusk, the ones in Boulder had apparently become quite comfortable being out and grazing in the open throughout the day. And then, on this day, Ponce was looking out her window at the deer when a sudden growl made the deer scatter and made her jump. Searching for the source, Ponce looked out, and about 20 feet from her house, next to a tree, there was a lion in broad daylight. It seemed to take her a moment to understand what she was looking at. There is a quote from Beast in the Garden where she said, "What, am I at a zoo?" Ponce had a 3-year-old daughter named Christina, and though described as a lover of animals, seeing a lion stroll through her garden, especially in the middle of the day, was unnerving. She notified her neighbors and also called the Division of Wildlife. A woman named Christy Coughlin, a wildlife manager, came out to the scene, but her response was allegedly, "What do you want me to do?" From reading the chapter, there's almost an air of annoyance from Christy, with supposed statements like, "I can't come out every time someone sees a skunk," and that without lions attacking anyone, there was no need to intervene, and there was the whole, "you chose to live here." She also stated the lion was probably just passing through, but to keep pets inside for a few days. To be fair, even individual lions do have a large home. In Path of the Puma, Jim Williams states, quote, that a grown female may lay claim to 80 square miles, while a male's home range could be twice that. Mountain lion research at UC Davis states, our studies show that mountain lions have large home ranges with an average of 125 square miles for adult males. So, maybe Ponce wouldn't see the big cat again. She did keep her cat, George, inside for a time, but one morning, when he was pining to be let out, she looked around and the coast seemed clear, and she didn't think it was fair to keep him in, so she let him out. Later that day, Ponce's mother came over to visit. Again, this is described in the chapter, but I'm going to read a piece directly from a paper at the time, from the Daily Camera. And so it was that Ponce, Gebhardt's mother, sitting in her kitchen on Wednesday afternoon, commented casually, "Oh, look at the mountain lion on your porch." Gebhardt thought she was kidding until she stared into the cat's eyes, end quote. It looked right back at her and didn't seem to care that she was there and continued on its way. She took a few pictures that were submitted to the Daily Camera. The lion was being spotted all over Knollwood now, strolling through gardens and climbing onto porches, and paying little attention to the people who were staring at it in disbelief. In the same paper, there's a section where a man named Larry Allen, quote, heard the family dogs barking in a downstairs bedroom, and when he checked on them, saw the lion snuffling around outside the sliding glass doors, end quote. It wasn't just pets the lions like to watch. According to a piece in The Spokesman, parents in suburbs outside Boulder, Colorado, told of spotting the cats regularly, even catching them peering through living room windows at children playing indoors. These lions didn't seem to have any fear of people, a fact that deeply troubled Michael Sanders when he came out to interview Ponce. Michael had previously worked in Yellowstone and was familiar with a grizzly sow referred to as Bear 59. Bear 59 had become famous for being tolerant of people, not fleeing when people came to snap photographs, which gave people the confidence to get closer and closer to the bear, until one day a photographer got too close, and Bear 59 went from being famous to infamous. Of course, bears and lions are very different animals. Bears will consume a variety of plants and berries on top of meat. Lions, however, only eat meat. Michael Sanders was working under Boulder County Parks, reporting to Dr. Jim Halfpenny, an experienced biologist. During a county parks meeting led by Dr. Halfpenny, he presented information on mountain lions and raised concerns about their increasing daytime sightings. Typically, these animals are crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk, making their frequent appearances during the day unusual. As previously mentioned, mountain lions are highly elusive, yet their behavior in this area appeared to have shifted. Sensing a potential change in their habits, Halfpenny and Sanders sought to gather more data to understand the situation better. While Jim and Michael continued to gather information on mountain lion sightings, Michael had the opportunity to go to a conference in Presto, Arizona in 1988, and he brought the photos Ponce Gebhardt had taken. When you read about this conference, it seems like Michael, only having about 6 months of experience with the mountain lions, was looking for advice from the more experienced specialists in the field, though it seemed like many people at the time weren't very concerned. Harley Shaw was the event organizer and was a well-known cougar researcher. Though Shaw didn't seem too fazed, most people he talked to didn't. However, he did speak to a couple of men who were more anxious when hearing his story. Lee Fitzhugh, who had worked around Orange County, mentioned the mountain lion attacks on Laura Small and Justin Mellon, and the chief ranger from Big Bend also informed him of the attack that happened there on the 8-year-old boy. The attacks in OC and Big Bend had a few similarities. Mountain lions displaying strange behavior, like regularly being seen during the day, and a lack of concern from some of the authorities, since it had been years and decades since any attack had been recorded. In the case of the park in Big Bend, there had been no recorded attack before there was one. To be fair, there were some notable differences. The men talking to Michael were telling him about people hiking in the wilderness, where mountain lions had been seen on hiking trails. The ones in Boulder were seen in gardens and neighborhoods. From the perspective of the two men who spoke to Michael, It was only a matter of time before something happened. Upon returning to Colorado, Jim and Michael resumed the survey around lions. They tracked one to a cliff not far from town, and after no noise or sign of the life inside, they decided to find out what was in there. And it wasn't really a cave at all, but a mine. But it had definitely been used by a lion. The abundance of animal remains clearly indicated as much. The mine was perfect really, plenty of space and nestled into the mountains. Numerous abandoned mines were prime real estate for the lions. As the number of sightings of mountain lions in residential areas continued to grow around Boulder and its surrounding areas, Jim and Michael thought something needed to be done. But before they could, they had to get permission from the Division of Wildlife. So they went to the headquarters in Denver to make their case. There was a number of people on the committee, including the aforementioned Christy Coughlin from before, and Director McCloskey. Now, if you read a book like Beast in the Garden, which you should, it's a good book, you get a sense that there was a rivalry between the Division of Wildlife and the Boulder Parks Department. I don't know if it's exactly true, and departments are made up of a variety of people who probably have different beliefs, but it might provide some context. What Jim and Michael wanted was pretty simple. They wanted a few radio collars put on lions. That way they could see if the lions being spotted really were just passers-by, or they had actually relocated and were living in residential areas. The problem, as the committee saw it, was that it would be difficult and expensive to pull off such an endeavor. It would require a bunch of manpower, hounds, even an airplane. Jim tried to assure them that he could get the funding from somewhere else. He just needed them to sign off, and that even if they could get one radio collar, it would be a huge help. But reading about this meeting in the book, I had to put it down for a second. Hadn't I already read this? Hadn't there already been a time when large predators were getting closer to humans without fear, with weird behavior, and didn't officials not think it was a big deal? And didn't it end up with lives lost? Grizzlies never killed someone in Glacier National Park until they did. I mean, hadn't it even become a trope? Even by the late 80s, the idea of officials in power not accepting a threat or willing to do something about it. There was another reason given in the book that I hope wasn't the main factor, but Barron mentions that in the 80s a tiger had been collared in a national park in Nepal, and then the tiger went on to kill a man, which led to the organization who collared the tiger to be sued. Sort of like collaring the tiger made it their responsibility. Again, I hope there were a variety of different reasons and that there was more to it other than we don't want to get sued. But either way, Jim and Michael didn't get permission. Sometimes after days like this, Jim and Mike would go to a local bar to discuss the day and the lions. Michael was mostly afraid about an attack happening around Colorado University in Boulder. He had a vision of someone being out late partying and then walking home drunk and stumbling into a lion. It sounded like a recipe for disaster. While no humans had been harmed, many pets had been. George, as well as many other cats, disappeared entirely. Some reports went to over 100 cats missing. A woman named Sherry Owen sent a letter to the Mountain Messenger in Coal Creek Canyon a few miles south of Boulder, complaining about how many cats had mysteriously gone, speculating a satanic cult had been taking them. And what about dogs? There seems to be a prevailing idea that mountain lions have an inbuilt fear of dogs, possibly stemming from a natural aversion from wolves. A study published in 2018 titled "Are Pumas Subordinate Carnivores and Does It Matter?" by Ann Kussler and Mark Elbroch from Panthera, an author of Cougar Conundrum. The study used, quote, 64 sources to assess dominance among pumas and other apex predators. The full study will be linked below, but to cut to the chase, there's a little graph that they are generally subordinate to wolves, grizzly bears, black bears, and jaguars, but dominant over coyotes and maned wolves. I say generally though, as it's always difficult to give an absolute statement with regards to wildlife and behavior. The Smithsonian had an article in 2021 titled "How Wolves Are Driving Down Mountain Lion Populations" that looked at studies in Wyoming where wolves were killing lion kittens and pushing adults to starvation by stealing the cat's kill. Again, generally speaking, it would seem that lions would want to avoid wolves, and therefore a natural aversion to dogs makes some sense. Though there are always exceptions. An article in National Geographic in 2023 talks about things going in a different direction in Washington, with quote, "The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife have documented cougars killing 6 collared wolves since 2013, almost 30% of the 21 documented natural wolf mortalities in the state." Though, to keep balancing this out, I'll quote a line from Path of the Puma where Jim Williams states, "While there have been instances of cats defending its kill against a lone wolf, or even killing a solitary wolf, that's the exception to the rule. Dogs chase cats, not the other way around." Back in Boulder and the surrounding areas in the late 1980s, dogs were starting to be attacked. Some of the earlier dog victims were a small poodle named Fifi, and then others like a terrier named Barney. He was owned by Rick and Teresa Overman. They had 2 small kids named Jenny and Christy, and the 2 dogs, Barney the small terrier, and then Thor the Great Dane. They lived in Coal Creek Canyon. One day when they returned home, they found an odd scar on Barney's forehead, but thought it was probably just an accident caused by playing with the large Thor. Then, a few nights later, Rick woke up to the sounds of Thor barking outside. It was mid-November. At first he yelled at Thor to be quiet, but when the barking continued, he went out to see what the problem was. When he approached the pen, he heard a snarl, and sweeping the flashlight around, he saw Barney in the jaws of a mountain lion. The lion snarled a second time before leaving Barney and leaping over the 6-foot fence. Rick woke up Teresa and brought Barney to the emergency vet clinic, but he didn't make it. Jim Halfpenny arrived a few days later to assess the scene. He told them he was sorry that their dog had died, and when he heard about what happened, and that Barney had been injured before, he told them that he thought the lion had probably been watching the family for a while, learning their habits and movements. It had probably swiped at Barney through the fence a few days before as a test before deciding to attack. The idea of a mountain lion stalking the family freaked them out, especially with 2 small children. While human fatalities are rare, throughout history, as I mentioned, it has been the young who are most vulnerable. The recent attack on pets had left people feeling uneasy, unsafe, and angry. There was a sentiment, it seems, that it was only smaller pets, cats and small dogs, that were vulnerable to attacks, as apparently the Division of Wildlife said, they aren't attacking German police dogs or anything like that. Well, a few days later, in early November in Aspen Meadows, a man named Bill Pierce let his dog Lance, an 85-pound Doberman, outside to go to the bathroom, only to hear the dog yelp. It was only a few feet away on the porch, but Lance was pinned down by a mountain lion. We don't know how large this lion was, but Bill said it made his dog look tiny. He yelled, clapped, waved his arms, and approached the lion to try and scare it away. But the lion didn't run. It looked up at Bill and snarled at him, and then dragged the dog away into the darkness. 5 minutes later, Lance returned, limping, whimpering, and covered in wounds. Now, perhaps you could make an argument that this wasn't a predation attempt and it was territorial or something else. Lance survived after all. However, as if the division had tempted destiny, Steve Headley went out to his yard to check on his German Shepherd Katie a few days later and found her dead, with her neck snapped and her insides open. The Division of Wildlife sent out a man named Tom Howard, who found lion tracks going to the pen in a straight line for hundreds of yards. This wasn't a mistaken encounter, this was deliberate. While the idea that lions have some fear over wolves and dogs has truth to it, I think there are some factors to consider. Size can be one, sure, but also I think numbers are a big factor. Certainly they will run from a pack of hunting dogs, but multiple dogs is different than just one. Even in the case in Washington, all but one of Washington's documented wolf kills by cougars involved lone wolves. If a lion is willing to ambush a wolf on its own, it seems to make sense that one could potentially target even a large dog. And if they're willing to attack a large dog, the increase in pet attacks made the public more aware of lions getting close and pressured the Division of Wildlife into holding a public meeting. The meeting took place in February 1990 in Coal Creek Canyon. And while he had no jurisdiction there, given the proximity to Boulder, Michael was curious what the division had to say, and he sat in the audience. Others, such as the previous mentioned pet owners, were also there. A presentation was given by a Division of Wildlife member who talked a little bit about mountain lions, gave some good advice like not encouraging deer into your garden and don't let your children play outside alone, but also gave some bad advice, which if recorded correctly in The Beast in the Garden, she said that if a mountain lion attacks you, you should play dead. Which, just from the very few times I've been in areas that have mountain lions, all of the signs say to retreat slowly, and if the lion approaches, to throw rocks, and if it continues on, to fight back. And just to double check, looking it up on the National Park Service website, they have the same advice. It seems there may have been some confusion with a bear attack, and then, even if you read the book, Bear Attacks, Their Causes and Avoidances, playing dead is a good tactic when being attacked by a female grizzly or sow that is defending cubs. Anyway, you might be thinking that people demanded that the Division of Wildlife do something about the dog-eating lions. Though it seems at first they demanded the opposite. People stood up and defended the lions, saying they had been smeared by the media and that they were here first, and that it was a privilege to live alongside them. Others in the crowd weren't so convinced. Some thought that some lions should be hunted. Others didn't think they should be hunted, but tranquilized and removed. Many were very pro-nature, but even some very environmentally minded people thought something should be done about the lions killing pets and livestock. The response from the Division of Wildlife, though, was that they could not act until there was a clear threat to people. No one had been attacked yet. So you can guess what happened next. Lynda Waters was a 28-year-old medical student living a few miles outside of Boulder. One weekend when she was home and her parents were out, she decided to go for a jog in the evening in 4 Mile Canyon. The run was okay at first, but when she rounded a bend, a mountain lion was in front of her. Some sources like the book state 15 feet, though a newspaper from the time, the Aspen Daily News, said about 10 feet. Either way, it didn't really matter, as it could close that distance in a moment. At first, she thought it was kind of cool. She hadn't seen a lion before. But then, the lion started walking towards her. She raised her arms above her head and yelled, but the big cat kept coming. What could make this situation worse? It's unusual for a lion to have no fear of humans and to continue to approach. It is also unusual for 2 lions to work together, but as Lynda was slowly backing up, a second lion came out of the bushes to her side. She continued to keep her arms high and yell, but these lions were not going to be scared off. Lynda realized this, and she started throwing any nearby rocks and twigs at the lions and scrambled up a nearby tree. As she climbed higher and higher, one of the lions pursued her up. The animal clawed at her leg, but Lynda repeatedly kicked it until it fell. The 2 large cats circled the tree for about 30 minutes, and then, again, a few slightly different details. According to the book, they spotted a deer, but in the newspaper it states the animals ambled to a nearby creek for water. But either way, they left Lynda, and she was able to escape. From the newspaper, there are some quotes from a spokesperson from the Colorado Division of Wildlife, Todd Malmsbury, and he does have concerns. Quote, "We're concerned about is, the usual thing for a mountain lion is to run away from a person. These didn't. And if lions learn not to be afraid of people, that increases the risks. However, they also said that this shouldn't be considered an attack. The book has a quote from Christy Coughlin that this is not in any way what I'd consider an attack, and apparently this incident was labeled as an encounter and not an attack, which seems a little odd. Though I will say, Lynda herself does say in the newspaper article that, quote, "I don't think they were trying to kill me, because if they wanted to, they could have." At this time, Michael and Jim had over 150 sightings recorded of lions close to humans, but during the summer and fall, the incidents seemed to be decreasing. On January 11, 1991, Officer Darren White was on patrol around Idaho Springs late at night when there was a call on the radio to go and see about a large animal. At first, being a new officer, he thought he might be dealing with a prank, but as he approached the area, he saw a mountain lion sitting on the road eating a deer. He didn't want to get out of his car, so he rolled up beside it, rolled down the window, picked up his handgun, a Glock apparently, and pointed it at the large cat, but then stopped. Did he really have a good reason to shoot this animal? He didn't have a license. The cat wasn't currently posing a threat to anyone or really causing any problems, so he decided to drive away. He later stated, however, that this was one of his greatest regrets in life, and if he could turn back time, he would go back and empty the entire clip into the animal. Scott Lancaster was an 18-year-old who lived in Idaho Springs. He had a part-time job in a Chinese restaurant called New Shanghai. He wasn't particularly academic and was failing a few classes, but he didn't seem to mind too much. He was more interested in sports like skiing and cross-country running. He just seemed to have a pretty carefree attitude. When he wasn't able to make the ski team, he still traveled with them to cheer them on, and he put most of his focus into the running. On Monday, January 15th, Scott was in Clear Creek High School. He had fifth period after lunch free, so he decided to go for a run, borrowing some of his friends' clothes and running shoes from their shared gym locker. He went on his route that went around the back of his high school and up the slopes, over the hill, and through the trees nearby. On his first lap, he ran past windows of the school, waving his arms around as he ran, causing the class to laugh at his antics. After a while, he disappeared and continued on his route, but the high schoolers waited for a second lap to see him again, but he never came back. When Scott initially went missing, the police didn't seem overly concerned. They thought he had perhaps run away from home as the pressure of school or the disappointment of being cut from the ski team got to him. But his parents, his girlfriend, and his friends didn't think that sounded like him. It was strange also that he had borrowed his friends' clothes for a run and never came back with them. As time went on without any word from Scott or his whereabouts, things started to get more serious. Alpine rescue teams were called to search the area where Scott had went running. Other volunteers combed the roads and creeks, yelling out his name, searching as many areas as they could. Scott had gone missing on Monday, and after a full-scale search on Tuesday, he still hadn't been found. It was thought by some of the searchers that he wouldn't be, at least not in the search area, and that maybe he had been kidnapped or other foul play had occurred. The search continued on Wednesday. People combed through the hillside, and as they did, a call came over the radio. A body had been found near a juniper tree. Steve Shalafo was an experienced member of Alpine Rescue, and upon hearing there was no chance of resuscitating the body, he approached with some of his team. There was a body laying on the ground with a large cavity in the torso. He got on the radio. They needed to get law enforcement down here. It seemed it was a murder after all, and a brutal one. As Steve looked around the scene, careful not to touch anything, someone said, "There's a lion behind you." Just 15 feet away, a mountain lion sat and stared at the team. A wild animal hanging around a crime scene, especially a homicide one, wasn't going to help the investigation. It even added an element of danger, being so close to people. At first they froze, but when the lion bolted forward, Steve pushed his team back and the lion ran up the hill, heading towards the other side where more volunteers, including some of Scott's friends, were stationed. Police were arriving on the scene, and when the call went over the radio, the crime scene needed to be investigated and the potential risk of the lion had to be dealt with first, especially with so many people out nearby. The call went out for Patrol Sergeant David Wallers, who had received sniper training from SWAT. As soon as he got the call, he jumped into his car and rushed to the scene. As the cat was coming over the hill, a few officers were nearby on the scene, and one attempted to take a shot, but it didn't seem to connect. The lion seemed to change direction a few times, but eventually came over the hill. On the other side, another member of Alpine Rescue, named John, was there with Scott's girlfriend and one of her friends. Looking through his binoculars, he could see the lion heading towards them. He quickly glanced around and saw an electrical tower. He told the two girls to run and to get ready to climb. At this time, David Wallers had made it to the top of the hill and got out. Scanning the surroundings, he could see the lion running downhill. He took out his rifle, aimed, and fired. Missed. He aimed again at the cat approaching the people below. He fired. The cat was down. Now the Puma was dealt with, the focus was back on the crime scene. Sheriff Cahill arrived and started looking over the area where Scott was found. His body had been partially covered in moss and twigs, and on the ground there were drag marks of blood. He looked at the injury again. Then he got on the radio. "We need to contact the Division of Wildlife." From an article published in the Tampa Bay Times on January 18, 1991, titled, "Jogger apparently killed by a cougar," in which there's a quote from Idaho Springs Police Chief Stuart Ney, who stated, "We're 99% sure this guy was attacked by a mountain lion. However, they still needed to do an autopsy to make sure. The lion was a male of about 100 pounds, a bit over 45 kilos. It was missing a few toes, but it was a fairly old injury that had fully healed. The lion was not emaciated or sick in any way, no rabies, and when they cut open its stomach, they found pieces of Scott inside. The teeth also matched up to the puncture wounds on Scott's body. The lion had killed and partially consumed Scott, and he had acted alone. On January 14th, 1991, Scott Lancaster became the first time in the recorded history of Colorado that a mountain lion killed a person. Perhaps it's unfair to look back at the actions taken or not taken by the division with hindsight. It's easy to look back now at all the warning signs when they are neatly laid out in a book or articles or documentaries and see the obvious conclusion. I suppose it did also seem that both Michael and Jim were trying to sound the warning bells, but we can't change the mistakes of the past. We can learn from them, and to their credit, the Division of Wildlife seemed to do so. Changes were implemented. The incident that happened to Lynda Walters was categorized as an attack. If lions were seen in a popular area, they were chased away with air horns or shot with something non-lethal like beanbags. If a lion made a kill near an area where people lived, the carcass was removed, and if a lion was habitually coming into an area near humans, it was tranquilized and moved, or if it was deemed a threat, it was shot. The tragedy of Scott Lancaster's death was a stark reminder of what can happen when warning signs are ignored. It is still true that mountain lion attacks on humans are extremely rare. These large cats are elusive, don't even like to be around people. They are the invisible ghost cats of the Rockies. But when a pattern of abnormal behavior is observed, then some action should probably be taken. As Mark Elbroch states in the Cougar Conundrum, can we coexist? Yes, of course we can and will. The story of mountain lions isn't one of hunting humans, but when warning signs are ignored, it occasionally can be. Massive thank you to all my patrons and members. I appreciate all the support. Anyway, thank you again. Hope you have a nice day.